When we look at the game elements of Elden Ring Nightreign, that is the characters, the items, the bosses, the maps, and the dungeons, and we look at the frequency of randomness in those elements, and also the swinginess or probability space of those random elements, what we find is that the random elements in this game are very discrete. And when I say discrete, what I mean is, if you look at the map, for example, it's broken into these different chunks where some of the areas are static and some are modular. And within all these areas, the enemies and items are discrete, where discrete means when you arrive at the poison ruins, you get poison scorpions, or when you arrive at the blood ruins, you get blood fiends. So the randomness is not continuous in the sense that you don't find these things in a blend together. You don't have a poison temple filled with blood fiends in it, or vice versa. And you're not going to find like a castle somewhere with Melania in it hanging out with a bunch of snails or something. Another good example of this is the castle in Limveld, where you either get only trolls or only crucible knights or only banished knights. You don't get like a mixture of all three. And so since player routing is a function of all these discrete random variables, that means the routing process produced by these variables is also discrete. And in some cases it's outright prescribed, like if you're doing the full Everjail clear strat on the base map, then in that case, from pretty much start to finish, you're saying, I know exactly where I'm gonna go for the full run. I'm gonna clear all the jails, then I clear the castle, and then clear whatever the weather event is on the map. And that's it. That's your whole run. You know as soon as you get into the game what you're doing. So you're taking the set of discrete variables, you're saying, okay, where did I spawn? What spawned around me? Where is the boss located? And as opposed to a more continuous random environment like full randomizer Elden Ring, where all items, all enemies, and even map continuity is shuffled, instead, it's more of like a plug-and-play situation where you're making a few key decisions along the way, but it's not this chaotic, continuous, random mixture where you have no idea where the run is going in the next 20 minutes or whatever. And this is where the title of the video comes from. It is like you take Elden Ring Randomizer, which is very continuous and fully blended, and then you downsample it. So it's like you have this heavily pixelated version of a random Elden Ring. It comes in these large discrete chunks, like a pixelated image. So despite the IGN review saying otherwise, I would say Nightreign is not a roguelite, and its components are much more similar to something like Resident Evil 3, where you're routing around rearranged, known, discrete modules. And we might say, well, what about the upgrade system and the RPG elements? Resident Evil 3 is not an RPG. And I think that could be true, but a lot of the times when you're picking your upgrades, you're usually just picking do more damage or take less damage. Most of the time you're not picking these really role-playing based kind of side grade specializations. It's gonna be most of the time more damage or less received damage. So the game is first and foremost an action game based on a time limit, and then seasoned with random elements, which is much more similar to something like Resident Evil 3 than something like The Binding of Isaac or these other roguelites. So if we're now analyzing the game first and foremost as a time limit based action game with random elements, then we have to primarily consider the game's combat mechanics and the game's timer mechanics. So if we compare Nightreign's combat to regular Elden Ring, we're going to find two main differences. First and foremost are the character abilities, which everyone's aware of. But on top of that, what a lot of people don't seem to really focus on is surge sprint and how it replaces crouching. And losing crouching is a big deal, because crouching let you do a lot of things. You could attack from crouch, you could also pivot from crouching. In some cases, you could sneak past enemies, and in some cases, you could save stamina by crouching. Well, now all of that is gone. So every setup that was based on crouching is now also gone. And that actually envelops a lot of different weapons from Elden Ring. Without crouching, you end up with a lot of setups that are either nerfed or completely suboptimal. And that includes two-hand great spear, dual-wield great spear, two-hand colossal sword, two-hand colossal weapon, dual-wield colossal weapon, dual-wield katanas, dual-wield great hammers, and probably a few more. So if crouching and everything that comes with is gone, it begs the question, was this change necessary? Did we have to put in surge sprint, and did we have to make it replace crouching? Would the game be unplayable without surge sprint? Since after all, the map is so big and the storm is so fast, if we could not surge sprint away, would we just be destroyed every run? Would the game be impossible? Well, I tried a few runs without ever using surge sprint, and unsurprisingly, the answer is no. You do not need to surge sprint to beat the game. And I think we're all aware of that now that we're more familiar with the game. So that is what I really think is the core misstep of the game. We put in surge sprint because the map is so large, we have to have some kind of traversal mechanic to compensate in order for the game to not be kind of boring to just regular sprint across the fields of Limveld, or to have the timer's tolerance be way too tight, because obviously the game is more difficult if you cannot surge sprint. The issue is that we have the map spread out so much that this is what the convenient solution appears to be. And maybe they said something like, well, crouching isn't going to be important in this game because that makes you go slower. We need them to go faster, not slower. So we're going to replace the button that makes you slower with a button that makes you faster. And so I think this is an illustrative example of having an issue in your world design leak and pollute into other elements of the game. The issue is that the world is just too big. We don't need to go across these giant empty fields in Limveld. And even if you want to argue that, that creates kind of a spacing element that gives weight to your decision trees that you as the player create and execute. So if you want to go all the way over here to this church, it's going to cost you a lot of time. But the timer cost for making those decisions is all relative. It's relative to how fast the storm moves and what the overall timer is. And so I'm not proposing this as like a trivial rework. It would require the entire map being remade. But if the map were smaller, if the map were more dense, you could create the same timer-based decision tree making on the player's part by scaling the speed, diameter, and overall time of the storms and of the nights to create the same feel of having to economize your time without involving these massive empty fields and cliffs that you have to traverse across constantly on the Limveld map. So the map is too big, so we need the players to be able to move faster. Okay, we're going to give them surge sprint. Now we've introduced a second order effect of this where the enemies have no equipment to deal with surge sprint. A lot of the times when you're stuck in a sticky situation in this game, the answer is usually just surge sprint. If you just surge sprint away from an enemy, a lot of them just do not have any capability to deal with that. Their kit, you can see, is designed around roll catching. If you roll away from an enemy, they'll usually punish you. But if you surge sprint and like jump out of the way, you can just fly away from them and leave them in the dust. And they can't really do anything. They'll chase you down, but in that immediate do or die situation, you can just surge sprint out, and most of the time you're fine. And that's not to say that surge sprint is some kind of magic invincibility button, because it's not. But a lot of the times it does kind of break the enemy player interaction and does function as sort of a get out of jail free card in a lot of situations where more fundamental movement like rolling or overall positioning could not help you. And to cover the other main combat change from Elden Ring, which is of course the character abilities, I am going to be that guy, and I am going to say the abilities do more overall to remove the player from the game's combat fundamentals. Even though I'm not that good at these games, I'm still going to say it. If you have a homing attack that makes you invincible with instant startup on the invincibility, then in that moment you don't really care about stamina or spacing or enemy state, whether they're doing a certain move or they're stunned. No, none of that has anything to do with my invincible 0 stamina Undertaker missile attack. Now, we could argue that since these moves are so good, and that since they save you a significant amount of time in a game with a timer, then we could say, okay, in the moment where we're using our ultimate ability, we're replacing the combat fundamental skill with the timer economy skill, where the timer economy skill involves you, the player, mapping out the time to kill of all your enemies and then pacing your ultimates with the local maxima of your entire run's enemy time to kill graph. So if you have a string of combat encounters, like a bunch of rats or something ahead of you, and you know they don't take very long, okay, don't ult the rats, don't waste your ult. You want to save your ult to chew through the high time to kill targets like bosses. And in doing that, you are effectively economizing your character. Then we can evaluate the game's roster of characters based on this time economy and based on who can consistently clear the most enemies and become the most powerful against the final bosses. The other important thing that your ults can do is revive your teammates. So the Guardian ult, the Revenant ult, Wilder's ult, even if you have the fire spread. If your teammates have 3 bars that they need to revive, it is much more efficient to use your ult on them than to try and actually hit them with your weapon with 3 bars while you have aggro. In some cases, with some bosses, that's basically impossible. So the ults at the end of the day for me, I think are a mixed bag. I don't like how they take you out of the fight in the sense that you're kind of just watching a cutscene when your character uses their ability. It is kind of like press X to Dark Souls, but at the same time, it is satisfying to have like a clutch revive moment with the ults. And I think the key difference there is that in the former case, when you're using it to damage a boss, right, you're taking yourself out of the game's combat, whereas in the latter case, reviving, you're actually using this new ability from the game to interact with another new ability from the game, reviving your characters. And likewise, the other great thing about ultimate abilities is you get a lot of charge for them when you dodge these new purple grab attacks. That is definitely something in the right direction. And honestly, I would be open to that actually being the only way to charge or activate your ult. Like with Undertaker, for example, she gets a free charge when she dodges a grab. I think that should be basically how every ult works, because that's just much more interesting and it is much more in line with the game itself. Okay, you took a risk to dodge this move that would otherwise kill you. You can retaliate with this enhanced firepower now. That, I think, is a lot more interesting than just off cooldown, hitting the bar, blowing everything up, watching the same little cutscene over and over again. That, I think, is a great example of the game being iterative, where the new characters kind of interact with the game's unique mechanics as opposed to the original cast. And in addition to the new characters, the new map from the DLC is so good. It is such a step in the right direction for the game because it has more density than Limfeld. It has more verticality. It is more interesting to route this map because it is much more complex and dense. And the crystal shattering mechanic is perfect. It is perfectly aligned with the game's core timer because you have to spend time collecting these little crystals that immediately when you collect them, they do nothing. They don't give you items, but once you smash 3 of them, or 4 if you're in multiplayer, then you get access to not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 areas. And yes, I'm counting the towers separately there. And this is a great example of the map design complementing the timer. You have to pay a time tax to collect these crystals. You have to incorporate this tax into your route, and then in exchange for doing that, you get access to more items and more XP. Another thing that I see some people dislike about the crystal map is you can fall off and die. But I would argue this still makes the map more interesting because not only has everything become denser, but the path to get to certain things is non-linear. So you have to incorporate that into your route, and it's not always as simple as beelining straight across a field or a cliff to get to whatever resource you want. Whereas if you compare this to Limfeld, it's really just, okay, go to the jails, okay, go to the Night Invaders, okay, go to the castle, okay, go to the volcano, okay, go to the city, okay, go to the boss. It is much more prescriptive, and a lot of that time is also spent running across empty fields or jumping up cliffs. And this is why it is so painful to see that this map cannot be manually set to non-DLC bosses. When you go to the little signboard and you change the weather, to guarantee that you get the map, you have to pick a DLC boss. Outside of randomly getting the map in the Deep of Night mode, you have to pick a DLC boss for this map, so you have to either fight the Meatball Garbage Man or the K-pop Demon Hunters if you want to play on the Crystal map. And speaking of those bosses, let's talk about the non-Night Lord bosses first. Some of the great Elden Ring bosses are completely absent from this game. And what's up with that? I'm just going to put them on screen, but yeah, while it would have been a lot more work to put some of the great bosses from the original trilogy in the game, I feel like these Elden Ring bosses you see on screen should be in this game in some form. While we're at it, there are some great bosses even from Sekiro they could have included. I mean, why not? The same could even be said for Bloodborne and Demon Souls, but those are tied up with Sony and whatnot. One of the peculiar things about the non-Night Lord bosses is that they are assigned to a particular Night Lord. They will only show up for a single Night Lord in many cases, which I think is very strange. This doesn't matter as much in Deep of Night mode because you can't pick your Night Lord in that game mode, but going back to wanting to always play on the good Crystal map, this is where the monotony of the game definitely rears its ugly head, because I don't want to fight the Curseblade gank or the Death Knight gank every time I'm on the Crystal map trying to fight the actual new bosses. So those are two examples of low-level effort changes that I think would help the game a lot. Have any boss show up for any Night Lord, and have any Night Lord show up for any map. And then regarding the Night Lord bosses themselves, with the exception of the jellyfish, I think all of the Night Lord bosses are good. I hate the jellyfish so much that from now on, when I say the Night Lords or the Night Lord bosses, what I'm really saying is the Night Lords minus the jellyfish. The Night Lords are easily the best part of the game, and I think all of them are good, except for you-know-who. So I'll just put my personal tier list on the screen and really leave it at that. I don't have much to say else about the Night Lords themselves, other than they're all great. What's not so great, though, is what happens after the Night Lord fight. After you fight the Night Lord, you get some meta progress in the form of these relic items and some currency for more relic items, which the RNG for these is terrible. The chances you roll a random set of buffs for your relic, what you're going to get is like bonus to pocket lint damage during a full moon while facing the southeast or something, as opposed to an actual god roll, which would just involve giving you more damage. But the other thing that happens after the Night Lord fight is that you are sent back to home base. So if you want to fight another Night Lord, or any main boss for that matter, you have to do another 30-minute or so long run. And notice how I'm wording that. I'm saying that after you fight the Night Lord, you go back to home base. So I'm not saying after you beat the Night Lord because it's not a win condition, and I'm not saying after you die to the Night Lord because it's not a punishment for losing. It's as soon as you enter the final boss room, that's it. Win or lose, you're going back to the beginning. And this is where the game loses a lot of steam, because after I beat a boss, I don't want to fight recycled mobs for 40 minutes again. And understand, when I say recycled, you got to keep in mind that a lot of these enemies are actually iterated from previous Souls games from before Elden Ring. Take, for example, the basic soldier guy you see at camps and forts, and he slashes his knife a bunch. That attack is actually from Demon Souls. So that attack is 16 years old. That attack is old enough to drive a car now. So you fight the Night Lord, you're engaging with the new good content, but then regardless of whether or not you win or lose, you're going back to 40 minutes of recycled older content that in some cases is over a decade old. And this is where what I said at the beginning, the discreteness, how discrete the game is, comes into play, because there's only so much variation that can take place on these maps. And when that limited variation is across a lot of old or samey content, the overall experience starts to become stale. And so the way I think to alleviate this staleness is, one, through condensing the game, which they do with the Crystal map, which is great, or the randomness could be made more continuous. And so you would have more random combinations of mobs. You would get more of a blend of different enemies in all of these areas. But if you do that to such a high degree, you would end up dissolving a lot of the routing strategies of the game because you have no idea which places could be more valuable at that point because it's random. So another option they could do is just make a bunch of brand new enemies. But then at that point, we're just talking about a whole new game. It's not Elden Ring Nightreign, it's brand new game Nightreign. So I think the final thing that could be done to enrich the game would be to add just a boss rush mode where we're saying, okay, we're not doing any runs anymore. We're just fighting the bosses, which thankfully someone has already made a mod for. I think a lot of people notice this at this point. It's so strange that FromSoft doesn't just do boss rush mode in their games outside of Sekiro. They just don't do that. To summarize my thoughts on Nightreign, I think the core issue of the game is that the original map was too large. So now you have this problem of the map being too large, taking too long to traverse. We have to speed this whole process up. What do? We run into the next main issue of the game where we have to get the character to speed up somehow, and in doing so, we're going to cleave a combat option from them, the crouch ability, which really ricochets through all of the movesets, all of the items in the game. And then at the same time, by giving us this traversal mechanic, we also mess up a lot of the enemy interactions. A lot of the enemies' movesets and AI have no way to deal with the surge sprint. And so those are the core issues within the game itself. And then there are these meta issues with the metagame of, okay, we have to go through the same map over and over again just to fight the boss. We can't fight every boss on every map. I think we could alleviate that as well by just adding a boss rush mode. But overall, I think the game is worth playing just because those Night Lord bosses are so good. And so because of the kind of quirks this game has, I think it falls into this very interesting kind of bimodal appeal range where if you didn't like Elden Ring very much, you might like this game because if you didn't really play Elden Ring or the Souls games, this gives you a chance to play through it with a team to help you so you won't feel like, oh, these mobs are so old, you've never fought them before. And you also don't have to deal with any RPG mechanics, really. And at the same time, if you really, really loved Elden Ring, then you're going to really love the Night Lords, so that's a great appeal. Really, it's that middle category. It's people who maybe played Elden Ring only once on one character, didn't pick it back up, kind of had a mild interest in it. In that case, maybe the bosses aren't enough to reel you in, and then at the same time, maybe the co-op isn't enough to reel you in. So I would say this game is really for super casuals, but then also super dedicated FromSoft fans. But let me know what you think. Let me know what your take is. Is the crystal map good? All my friends in real life hate the crystal map, by the way. That's why I spent so much time in the review defending it, because it's like the crystal map is awesome. But let me know what you think about the maps, about the bosses, and thank you very much for watching.